We are back today with some blood work information.
Man?
What's going
Yeah,
on?
not too much, dude. I'm excited to get through this. I think it's an important topic, and it might not be that practical in the sense for a lot of bodybuilders, but it is going to be relevant because it's one of the panels that you will most often see whenever you get labs drawn. I mean, you'll virtually see it every time you get labs drawn, whether you do it for your doctor or do it for yourself.
Yeah. So we're talking about the CMP, right? Comprehensive
Mm-hmm.
Metabolic Panel, which is at the
Yes.
front of every lab that any doctor is going to write for.
Right.
And I think people just see, like, as bodybuilders, one, we should be getting lab work done often. It's very important. Generally,
Yeah.
everyone should be getting lab work often. But bodybuilders, if they're putting their health at risk, should be getting lab work more often. And a lot of times these things are skewed. I spend a lot of time on calls with people that have concerns over lab work. I'm sure you're the same. Right. And it's daunting.
Yeah.
A lot of doctors don't explain this stuff, but you get an email copy of these labs and there's flags and,
Right. Say, hey, you should look into this, or hey, I'm going to refer you to X, Y, and Z because, alternatively, I don't really know myself.
yeah. Yeah. Well, and on a side note, an interesting thing about medicine. So medicine is based on averages, first of all. So that's where these ranges come from. They're not necessarily based on, extraordinary individuals. They're just literally just based on averages. And doctors tend to write for things that are not actionable. So this is kind of an interesting thing. And I've had interesting experiences with this. So you typically, as a physician, you're not going to write for a lab that you don't understand fully. And doctors they don't have to understand all these things fully. The CMP, you would hope that they would understand most of these, but like some of the more specific things, I've seen a lot of doctors that don't know ALT and AST, right? That's a super common one that people screw up. And so they tend to not do those because then they're responsible. So if they were to write for something that could point to a disease and they don't know how to deal with it, they don't want to deal with it after the fact. They'd rather someone else handle it.
Right.
So we're going to start. What do you want to do? Protein first?
Yeah, we can go through that. We can start with protein. So I think just at an overview, we're just pulling up panels here. You have on the most comprehensive metabolic panels, at least if this is generic across the board, I guess. So you're going to get a glucose measurement. You're going to get your electrolytes tested. So sodium, potassium, chloride. You're going to get kidney function, which will usually be blood urea nitrogen or BUN, creatinine, EGFR, so estimated glomerular filtration rate. Then you have your liver function, which is your transamerases, and then alkaline phosphate, and then total bilirubin typically, and then protein, which is just total protein, albumin, globulin, and the like. So those are kind of what we have at a large. But if we want to start with protein, let's crush it.
Sure. So, I mean, the first one typically is albumin, right? Which does have some relevance to bodybuilders because it's
right. Yeah, it's made at basically by the protein, right, or by your liver. So, in general, I think the relevance is also, to be honest, the relevance is mostly indicating if a bodybuilder is dehydrated as they're getting the lab work. Usually, that'll be wildly elevated if one is dehydrated prior to or during the lab work itself.
Yeah. So, like you said, high albumin is usually, insulin or hormonal issues, dehydration, or sometimes a diet, like what a typical bodybuilder, if their diet is high in protein, it can also throw this marker off. I've seen it.
Right.
Dehydration is an important thing. On a side note, before you get labs, unless your doctor specifically said don't drink fluid, which is rare, when doctors say don't eat 12 hours before your blood work, that doesn't mean don't drink fluid, right? People are assuming it's like surgery where you don't want to aspirate. For blood work, you want to be as hydrated as possible because it'll throw all these markers off. And we see that all the time with the hematology stuff like hematocrit, hemoglobin that we'll get to later. That's vastly changed by hydration state.
100%. And I think it's another important point here is it scales per your size. So, and it really needs to be stated that even having a modest amount of muscle compared to an open bodybuilder, even classic physique guys, you're still more muscled than general population, and that is going to skew your average lab results compared to the general pops and also your requirements, right? So hydration as well will scale with that. So even if you have 10 pounds more lean body mass than the average individual, you're still going to need much more to be hydrated than an average individual, and that might be a liter of water before blood work, 2 liters of water before blood work. You might not get away with just a glass, like somebody just walking off the street would be able to, right?
Yeah. So people ask me all the time about water requirements, or like my clients will ask me how much water. I tend to not get too particular about measuring water. I think it's one more complicated thing that they might not need to know. When they're competing, I think that's important to understand water consumption down to the ounce. But I tell most people to drink water until your urine is basically like a very light yellow to pretty much clear, right? You don't want it fully clear, and you don't want it dark yellow.
Yeah, exactly.
So whatever amount of water that takes for that individual.
Right. Yeah. And so in the most cases that I've ever even witnessed, it's just elevated due to dehydration. I think an important note or feature of albumin is that it does act as a transport for various substances like hormones and different compounds that we use. So depending on the elevation, you might have a different outcome in terms of active drugs or pharmaceuticals in your blood and their actual effect. But I don't think it's very often elevated or depressed in normal functioning people. Maybe if you're malnourished, you have kidney disease, you have a high degree of inflammation or inflammatory bowel disease like Paul has, or Crohn's or something like it. It can be depressed, but it's very rare to even see any abnormal modulation within that lab, because simply put, it's mostly just driven by dehydration.
Yep. So really that's the majority of protein, right? Then we have really electrolytes are the next major thing.
Yeah. Electrolytes. I mean,
it's a touchy subject. I think nowadays, I think I started a lot of drama with electrolytes.
Yeah. I personally, again, I don't think these are very often skewed. You can take compounds that will skew them, and your dietary intake can usually make very, very minor adjustments. And because your body has such an amazing capacity to regulate these and make sure that they're in tight regulation, but they can move a little bit. Like, for example, some people like to say that, and it can be true, telmisartan or any A or B for that matter can increase serum potassium levels and maybe even put them outside of reference range. It's a plausible effect. I've seen it happen in some individuals, but I think for the most part, everyone sort of knows what sodium, potassium, and chloride are. Sodium basically helps movement of water in your body, as well as in general, the blood test can indicate abnormal levels of dehydration, overhydration, or healthy hydration. And then potassium is very much the same. It can indicate sort of dehydration or hydration. And chloride is sort of very similar. I mean, the electrolytes in terms of blood work aren't super actionable unless there's something really wrong, kidney function wise or else.
So I have one kidney, as you know, you're aware, unilateral renal agenesis. And so my potassium gets skewed. So I supplement with potassium. And so I tend to hold more fluid because of that. So certain drugs work differently in my body because I don't excrete them at the same rate necessarily. Although my kidney function is considered normal. And on labs, my kidney markers, I don't know if I've ever sent you my labs. My kidney marker, you would never know by looking at my labs that I only have one kidney, because it hypertrophied when I was a baby to match this, basically be 1.5 times the size. It just, still the filtration is not going to be exactly the same.
Right.
Even though on lab work, it just shows how inaccurate some of these things are, that they didn't know until I was 40 that I was missing kidney.
That's so
with
wild.
all the blood work in the world, they had no idea it was gone.
That's so wild. That's so wild.
The interesting one on so really with electrolytes, the sodium and potassium, right? And very rarely do you see them off. Especially sodium. Like I've never seen anyone in America or ever read anyone in any civilized nation who is really deficient in sodium. You really have to try, or like you said, telmisartan at the end of near bodybuilding prep when you've removed salted food and things, perhaps, but it's pretty challenging if you're eating meat and you're eating any amount of normal food to be deficient in sodium. Potassium's a little tougher, right? I mean, our environment doesn't really have a ton. They estimate Paleolithic man had something like a 16-to-1 potassium to sodium ratio. It doesn't mean that's ideal. It just shows that like our body typically had more potassium because we were eating a lot more green material than we do now. Chloride is the silliest one because chloride technically has no clinical outcome when it's skewed. It's a marker that other electrolytes are typically off, but you get your chloride from your sodium. So it's like if your sodium's low, your chloride's going to be low and vice versa. I know of no actionable thing with chloride being skewed. I could be wrong.
Yeah, the only thing I've ever seen is a possible correlation to congestive heart failure, but that's
it usually goes back to sodium or something though.
Exactly. They tie all in together. I think hypernatremia and hyponatremia are probably the most important to look at, and in reality, like the most commonly ways that those will get skewed is just even dietary intake of salt is like hard to skew serum levels, but certain medications, specifically corticosteroids, diuretics, and I mean, that's really the only thing that would in anabolic steroids. Yeah, I mean, in general. And then, of course, ACE inhibitors, potentially ARBs, things of that nature.
Yep. Growth hormone.
Yeah, growth hormone's a great one. Yeah.
Sodium retention by the kidneys. It usually balances out over time, but you will see, I don't know what your experience is, when growth hormone is first used, generally there's some huge amount of water retention in your ankles and your feet. It's like preeclampsia, and then it kind of just subsides. But it's funny when you first get it because your feet look really horrible.
Yeah,
and that's the sodium.
They look like tree trunks. It's pretty nasty, but.
And then what do you want to do next? You want to do so we have kidney and liver, basically the two things left.
Yeah, I mean we have glucose. I think for glucose, it's just a pretty easy topic to discuss. Elevated glucose, not good. Depression of glucose usually is just that you're dieting and you have too little carbohydrates going in to support normal, like what would you call normal glycemia? I think it's called, is the technical term for, but in general, it's just measuring the actual amount of sugar or glucose in your blood. High levels indicate usually insulin insensitivity or prediabetes, while low levels are just hypoglycemia. And I think generally the proxy there is, if, for me at least, if you're above about 90 milligrams per deciliter as a bodybuilder, you might need to look at potential routes of alleviating the elevation, because likely that means fasting insulin's a lot higher, or that would lead you to say, let's get a blood test with fasting insulin and see where that's at, and maybe even C-peptide to just see kind of what my body's doing in response to having such a high blood glucose. And if everything looks normal, it might not be an issue for you, and that might be kind of your normal set point for whatever reason. But if it is skewed in those latter results, then you might want to make an action to correct whatever's going on.
Yeah. So normal, I mean, for normal people, you want to see, somewhere in the mid to high 70s to, low 90s is pretty standard.
Yeah.
It's when it goes 100, 120 is considered pre-diabetic. And it's something, I always forget about. Guys buy those silly constant glucose monitors that you use in diabetes. Those really have no valid application in normal people. People do not need to monitor your blood glucose. That was just, they were basically selling leftover diabetes technology to normal people. Your blood sugar has to fluctuate or you'd be dead. It's going to move up and down. It's not actually telling you about anything. You just want it, what you and I care about, or what a doctor cares about, is fasting glucose, like you said. Like, you want it ideally not hypoglycemic, but you want it as low as possible, right, when you're fasted. And you want an A1C is basically just a 3-month snapshot of that, right? So you can actually get a more accurate, because with glucose, sometimes with bodybuilders, we see some funky things that are not necessarily accurate. You get something called the dawn effect.
Yes.
Where if you eat, depending on what you do, like I eat before I go to bed, generally, nothing crazy, but it doesn't disrupt my sleep, as long as I'll probably have some sort of protein, maybe some protein and some fat before I go to sleep. And depending on how your body metabolizes that, it might throw your blood sugar off. So when you wake up and you test it, it's artificially high. So sometimes that's not accurate, right? And also things like growth hormone are going to skew blood sugar. It shouldn't be skewing it all the time, though. Your fasting should still come back to normal. It's A1C. At least what I typically see is A1C tends to elevate slightly from growth hormone use, but the fasting shouldn't really be changing, right? It's when the fasting changes from it that it's a problem to me.
Yeah. And even, I mean, here's the thing, right, with that, and that's a highly controversial topic, I guess, in and of itself, but I have never seen, and I'm a big fan of, and I think we all are at this point, but high dose growth hormone usage with clients and myself. And I have never seen blood glucose elevation if the person is living a healthy lifestyle, just as a prerequisite, right? Like, if you're getting, 8 to 10,000 steps a day at the higher end, if you're generally speaking not a couch potato and you're active, either just mentally active, like actually trying to cause some respiration within the good old brain of yours, or, you know, moving around and doing things, getting outside, like just the simple shit, like living like a normal human and touching grass every once in a while. Usually blood glucose will remain generally stable in most cases, even at extremely high doses of growth hormone. I think it's the people who just simply don't move all day. They'll eat a meal and they'll go sit back down on the couch and let that ferment in their gut, and blood sugar spikes, but there's virtually no way to manage it, that it becomes an issue. And really beyond that, I think it's not even something to worry about. Like you will be fine, you know, just live a healthy lifestyle and you're good.
Yeah. I just checked my recent blood work and my fasting glucose was a 77.
Yeah.
Mine always runs low, but so it's a 77, but that was on growth hormone. And
right.
My A1C was a 5.0.
Yeah.
So it shows you that, like, again, if you stay leaner, if you make some effort to not be a slob and get up every once in a while, at least do something. Generally, it should at least not be horrible, right? I do some level of cardio. I take care. I eat fiber. I'm not pumping refined garbage in my mouth all day long. The other ones that keep it that I would always look at too when glucose is off is triglycerides, right? That's kind of a dangerous combo. When triglycerides are elevated and glucose is elevated, it's not good.
Right. Yeah. I'm just looking at my own lab work to see what I had going on here. And when I was taking 10 units of growth hormone per day, and my glucose was at, well, I'm trying to find it here. It's been a while since I've got blood work. Holy fuck. I put everything in a folder. I don't know about you, but I'm like hyper meticulous.
I have by year or two.
Yep. by year, by month.
That's relevant to me to go look back 5 years ago.
Yeah, it was 87 when I was taking 10 units of growth hormone.
Great.
Yeah. So
that's more normal. Mine's low. Mine's like borderline hypo.
You're a freak in terms of
I'm at the point now where I need to add dietary fat back to my diet to keep my blood sugar stable, because like even if I eat 200 grams of carbs, my blood sugar moves really fast.
It's so crazy.
I'm doing the opposite of what most people should be doing.
Yeah.
And I do have a video coming out. People keep bothering me. I do have a video of a high day coming out. I just have to edit all the footage together because it took me hours.
That's awesome.
The other one we missed with electrolytes that is important is calcium, right? Because of cardiac stuff.
Yeah, calcium.
It's just good to look at. If there's obviously an issue with calcium, then doctors will look further at cardiac things. That can be a dangerous one. And then, so kidney function, right? This is one of those ones that, like, again, is useful, but it doesn't really tell you the whole story. Some of these things are a little outdated, right? So you basically have BUN and creatinine, EGFR. I mean, and even some of those EGFR is not even always on everyone's labs, right? The basic, I believe, is just BUN and creatinine.
Yeah.
Or creatinine.
Yeah. And for BUN, it's basically a measurement of it's blood urea nitrogen. It's measuring the nitrogen in your blood, and nitrogen as a waste product. And the reason that this is such a problematic marker is, and it's kind of irrelevant in our use case, is because it can, elevated levels indicate potentially dehydration, kidney disease, or that you're just wasting a lot of nitrogen, which in the case of bodybuilders is very, it's like you definitely are if you're training hard and you're eating a lot of protein. And it's the same thing with creatinine, is it's a waste product of muscles. And if you just have higher muscle mass, and you train and you eat protein, you're going to have higher creatinine, far beyond what a normal person who has a lesser than desirable body mass index and doesn't train is going to have, which is usually what these reference ranges are tailored to.
And so, and in medical school, the funny thing is it's taught that a human male can only gain 30% more muscle mass than their baseline. So it just shows you how skewed these numbers are, because in the medical world, that's considered massively muscled. So that's why these numbers are so off, right? Because even a guy who goes to the gym casually is probably gaining more than 30% muscle mass. He's eating right.
For sure.
And a guy on steroids is a whole nother level. And obviously if things are wrong here, it makes sense to then pursue other kidney marker, tests. It's not as common. I don't personally see bodybuilders tend to not have kidney issues. It's really not generally what gets bodybuilders. tends to be cardiovascular events, in my experience. Although kidneys are definitely worth watching once you've started to damage them.
Yeah. I mean, in all of the clients I've ever coached, and including myself and people in my circle, I've seen 2 people who have concerning lab markers and in relevance to kidneys. And then we had further testing done, cystatin C and others. And then we had urinalysis done to ensure, right? And in one of those cases, someone actually had like prehistoric kidney issues that he, kind of like yourself, who he didn't know up until that point. He went to go see a nephrologist, learned about something that was going on. I can't remember this exact use case scenario, and the other person just had an STD. So the 2 times I've seen kidney issues was sort of irrelevant to bodybuilding. But I do think, like you said, these could be a good indication to just simply say, hey, let's get a cystatin C, see what's going on a little bit more accurately. And a urinalysis is so cheap, and it will let you know there's protein in your urine. And if there is, okay, now we need to do something about, the process. And maybe that means get an ultrasound and see like what your kidneys are doing. Basically, if there is sclerosis or you have any issues, like yourself, you might only have 1 kidney and you just never knew until now.
It's supposedly it's not that rare. It's only in men. It's my understanding, but it's not as rare as you think. And most guys never find out. They go their whole life without knowing. They find out.
I mean,
their relatives
very
find out
rarely. I've never heard of anyone optionally getting a kidney ultrasound.
No.
So it's
now you would know. The only benefit, kids born now, I don't know, you might fall into this generation because they do ultrasound on the mother now. So they would see the baby's kidneys. That's how we discovered it. I'll tell you this. It's not a story that's not necessarily worth on this video, but they were doing ultrasound on my wife when she was pregnant. And they noticed a kidney thing with the baby. And that's when I went and got work done.
That's so interesting.
But you wouldn't know because I was born in the 1970s. They didn't do ultrasound. That was real. I don't even know if it existed.
Yeah. That's so interesting.
Or it didn't exist for that general use stuff. But yeah, cystatin C. If you have something wrong with your kidney, cystatin C is going to be a lot more accurate of a blood test, even though we see a lot of doctors don't even know what it is.
Yeah, most doctors, and it's cheap too. It's like, and if a doctor tries to upcharge you for it, here's another word of advice: hundreds of dollars, just go buy it privately. It's like a $16 test. It's not expensive at all.
Yep. And if people, I don't know what you have available to you. When I do consultation calls, if someone needs lab work and they don't have an option, I can give them something for LabCorp so they can get it done if they need it. Okay, so liver, really the 3 main ones that they generally look at are ALT, AST, bilirubin, and then ALP as well, which to me is interesting. I learned something about ALP recently that I did not know. We can touch on that if you want, but ALT and AST are almost always elevated in bodybuilders. It's like the one that's always out of range and everyone freaks out about, and it's like slightly above range, when in reality, liver failure is in the thousands. It's super high. I saw one the other day, a guy's ALT was in the 2000s. So that's liver failure. Liver failure is not a 52.
Right. It's most often, I think we both kind of harp on this, but it's most often elevated due to muscular damage. It's just the byproduct of what we're doing. I think, correct me if I'm wrong here, but from what I recall, and this is very vague, ALT is more of a representation of long-term potentiation of damage to your hepatic system through like possibly fatty liver disease, liver cirrhosis, or something of the like. But I could be wrong there and just completely speculated. But I think ALT is more of the long-term sort of indication that something might be wrong, and AST is more of an immediate.
Yeah. Okay. Generally, they kind of go hand in hand. You usually see when one is elevated, the other one is usually.
Yeah, right.
You generally don't just see one.
Right.
One might be higher than the other. Lots of things that we do. So it's basically just the amino acid alanine. It's just the breakdown of that muscle releases alanine first. Bloodstream, and then goes to liver, and you're basically just picking up on that. And bilirubin too is just another waste product that you tend to see in the liver. A side note on the liver, an interesting thing is, and going back to dehydration again, the liver is responsible for about 500 things in the human body. And it's an incredible job. It's all the time, many, many, many things. And one of the things that occurs in the liver is it's where the breakdown of fat occurs, right? It's where fat loss starts. The beta oxidation occurs in the liver. And if you are dehydrated, the liver can't really do that anymore. And you will, if you're dehydrated, then it passes on. I'm drawing a blank. Basically, if you're dehydrated, the kidneys can't do their job either and filter your blood. So you screw the whole thing up. So it's not healthy if you are a bodybuilder and trying to lose body fat to be dehydrated, because you'll screw the whole process up by not drinking enough fluid.
Right.
ALP, which is interesting. So it's an enzyme as well that they use to show damage in the liver. It actually there's actually ALP receptors everywhere in the body, and it shows magnesium deficiency. Which is an interesting thing. So you can use that a lot of times to determine if someone actually needs more magnesium in their diet.
That's interesting. That's really cool.
So then what else do we have on? We did electrolytes, protein.
I think that's honestly it. I mean, we didn't cover EGFR, but that one's pretty, I think it's sort of not, unless you're calculating it with a cystatin C, I wouldn't take your word for it in terms of, because EGFR, I think it's just right off the jump, the E stands for estimated. It's an estimated measurement of your glomerular filtration rate. There's not actually a measurement for that. So if it is depressed, it could mean decreased kidney function, but it could just be a mismeasurement, and maybe you should calculate it with cystatin C. And there is calculators online. You can type in EGFR with cystatin C, and a calculator will pop up, and you can do the calculations yourself. So yeah, I don't even think that one's super applicable in most cases, unless you're getting further testing done. But I think that's a whole CMP panel right there.
Yeah. The only other thing we could touch on, we could do CBC really fast, because it tends to go with that, right? Just, that's just basically the hematology part of the blood. So basically you have just the red blood cell count and the white blood cell count are basically the two major parts of that, right? Yeah. You're really just looking at hematocrit, hemoglobin, and then immune stuff, which we don't necessarily need to touch on the immune stuff, but and I just brought the CBC up because you tend to see skewed hematocrit and hemoglobin in bodybuilders. They use steroids, not necessarily natural bodybuilders, but and this is another one that some doctors are very quick to recommend. You see a phlebotomist, you donate blood if it's even slightly elevated. A lot of times it is just dehydration causes this. I would retest if it's right on the edge. I would make sure you're hydrated. And I'm of the school of thought, unless it's a few points over consistently, that it's not necessary to immediately give blood, because some of the performance advantage that comes from anabolic steroids is from this increased red blood cell count.
Yeah. Who is the endurance athlete? They call them Mr. 60.
Lance Armstrong.
Yeah, Lance Armstrong. And
he's super high.
And that's like their goal is to do that, right? They'll move to a place of higher elevation to get an increased red blood cell count, basically induce polycythemia on themselves to improve performance. So as a person who has elevated hemoglobin and maybe hematocrit, like I wouldn't get concerned unless it's far. And I shouldn't say that, because it's maybe prescribing unhealthy behaviors. But if you do have elevations, I would look at how far is it elevated, right? If it's just a hair over the reference range, you don't need to go give blood. You don't need to stop eating red meat and vitamin C. You don't need to do crazy things. Just make sure that it's not, way beyond the reference range, right?
Yeah, and that's all it is. And looking at the other lifestyle factors, right? It doesn't mean in and of itself, it's not necessarily, it's considered a risk factor in and of itself, but that doesn't mean that in reality that it is. If you look at the other things, if someone is healthy outside of that, the other markers are not showing a risk. It's not, you're not going to immediately have a stroke because it's 1 point over. If it's, if hemoglobin is supposed to be, it caps out at 17.2 and you see it at 17.3, it's like a lot of doctors will freak out. It'll be okay. Elevated.
Yeah, you'll be just fine. White blood cells are kind of important for me, as this is when I see this is a little bit skewed more often than not. And this is more so just a response to, kind of like you said, inflammation and immune response. And I think where it is important is just like, if you have leukocytosis and you have, it's potentially an indication of bacterial, viral / fungal infections. And I don't think a lot of those are applicable in a bodybuilder, but bacterial infections, just due to the food we eat, the amount of it, and sometimes the cheat foods you eat. If you have elevated, really, I mean, to be honest, any of the white blood cells or just a total white blood cell, it's usually can be an indication of some bacterial infection, whether that is a small intestinal overgrowth or something like leaky gut or a true autoimmune disease. There's usually something going on there. So it's worth looking at, but it's not necessarily worth, flipping a table over about.
Yeah. And there's 1, 2, 3, 4, there are 5 major white blood cell counts.
Yeah.
Neutrophils, lymphocytes, monocytes, basophils, and
xenophils. Yeah.
Xenophils. And they all look at different things. So when a doctor is looking at what is elevated and what's not, because generally they're not all elevated at once. It's, one or two.
It's one or two.
Elevated slightly. It'll tell a doctor what exactly is wrong, because some are for parasites, some are bacterial infections, some could be an allergy.
Right.
It's just showing what your body's constantly dealing with pathogens all day long. It's just showing what your body's doing. Ideally, the numbers are in range, right? But these again lead to other blood tests depending on what's wrong, right? These are how things like cancer can be detected initially, as if some of these things are elevated,
right?
But neutrophils are, I believe, are the largest, right? That's like 75 or 80% of all of the white blood cells in the human body. So that's like the largest portion, and then I think you have lymphocytes are after that. And the other ones tend to be much smaller.
And usually if you have depression in any of those, you have some form of, I mean, it's pretty rare. You have some form of HIV, cancer, you're going through chemotherapy, or you truly have an STD. So,
or you're on antiviral drugs for a reason, right? There's something wrong. Yeah. Yeah. And I think what you were talking about, inflammation, would be like monocytes. Like you would see, right? There's some sort of chronic inflammation, like a gut thing.
Yeah. Neutrophils would be mostly like a bacterial issue. They're all, you can actually look up, there's some really cool cheat sheets on just Google. If you just type in, white blood cell cheat sheet, and it'll come up with sort of all the differentiation and what each one's elevation could represent. Yeah.
It's pretty neat. Cool. Well, I think that's, I think we could always do another one and go into some of the more, like the endocrine ones.
The endocrine ones would be great.
Would be kind of interesting, right? So testosterone, total testosterone, estrogen. Because there's a lot of newer science too, like we touched on with some of the free stuff that's in serum, which is kind of groundbreaking for some of this stuff. And thyroid stuff. Cool. You probably see thyroid stuff skewed all the time too. And a lot of times, again, that's not giving you the whole picture.
Right.
And a lot of them play off each other. That's the thing you have to understand with all of these lab markers. It's generally they're not standalone things. That when one is off, it's showing that something else is generally off. It gives you a place to look. Like when I see thyroid off, I'm looking somewhere else as well. I'm not just focusing on the thyroid. And I think this is where a lot of practitioners go wrong, is they're not taught what the relationships are between these things.
Right.
Some of them you learn it in practice just by looking at them all day long.
Right. Yeah. It's such an important feature. You have to sort of like if your hematology is messed up, usually it's going to be, you want to look at several, and like your mean corpuscular volume, and just look at all the different components of it. And that can lead to a story that is much greater than just, your red blood cells being a touch high or something like that.
Yep. Very cool. Okay. Thanks, Kolton. We can,
appreciate it.
We'll do another one of these. Kolton and I plan to do like a weekly podcast on these various topics. If anyone thinks of any other topic that they want to hear from us specifically, you could put it down below in the comments. I always link Kolton's stuff. So Kolton's a coach. And, obviously a businessman, a very well-read friend of mine. And
I appreciate it.
So I'll link all your stuff down below, and I will talk to you later, brother.
All right, man. See you.
Thank you so much.